Hi guys, it's Naz here with a very grumpy Tempest shadow. Today I'm going to be showing you a bunch of tips and tricks on how to get perfect embroidery placement. It's not as simple as a lot of people would think. So I've shown this method a few times on my Patreon, but it's taken me a long time to actually make a video about it and go into a bit more detail. So I'm going to be using Tempest here as an example. I wanted to make a grumpy Tempest, so I used her as a base to show you guys all the steps. The first thing you need to do is you need to finalise your head pattern in whatever fabric you're going to be using for the embroidery. Tempest is made from some dyed minky for her dark purple, so I'm using some scrap dyed minky so that I will have the same stretch when I compare the embroidery on this to the final product. You don't really want to use something that's going to be vastly different, and the closer you can get, the more precise your embroidery placement's going to be. So once you've finished making your pattern, what you need to do is you need to get the eyes or whatever you're going to be putting on as the embroidery for your plush. In this case I'm doing the eyes in Photoshop, and I've just made a simple vector puppet. I have a tutorial that I made ages ago on how I do it, but essentially I've made a vector in Photoshop. Everything is vectorized, so I can move all the iris, the eye shines, the eyelids, eyelashes, etc. all around. And I've just gone in and traced that reference of that eye, trying to take into account that it needs to be warped horizontally a little bit because that eye was in sort of a sharp 3/4 view. Now I'm opening up an A4 piece of paper and I'm just printing out an assortment of eyes in different sizes. You can then get your final head, and then you're going to choose the eye that you think matches the scale that you want. You can take photos of this and bring it into Photoshop and overlay images of your reference to make sure that it's the right size, or you can just eyeball whichever eye size seems like the right one. So I printed out about 4 different eye sizes, and this was the one that I liked the most. You can see here that I'm just using pins to pin it onto the face, roughly where I want it to go, sort of taking into consideration the angles when viewed from the side and the front, and I'm just pinning all the way around to get it roughly laying flat onto the front of the head. The next step is going to be getting a Sharpie marker, and I'm going to be tracing around the outside of this eye. If you want something to be a little bit more specific, you can try and disassemble your eye a little bit, cut it apart, and then trace all the different elements of the eye. So in this case I went ahead and I cut off the eyelid, and then I traced where that met the eyelashes and drew in roughly the iris and all those sorts of things. Now I've got a reference in front of me on my phone so I can sort of compare it on the fly, and I'm just going in and drawing in her nostrils and where I want her mouth to go. Now this is important for when you're doing mouths that go over seams. They're very tricky, and you really want to take care to make sure that your marks are really clear, especially at the point where these lines intersect over the seam. You don't want your lines to be too fuzzy, or when you end up drawing the final version of your embroidery you won't know exactly where to line them up on that seam. So I've drawn in her mouth, given her a little bit of a crooked frown, and now I'm going to go ahead and remove those eyes. And after that I'm going to unstuff the entire head, and I'm going to unpick all the seams, and then I'll have flat versions of my pattern that I can scan in, and then I'm going to digitize my embroidery files, or at least make the images for them in Photoshop. So you can see here that I've only focused on the eye on one side. If your pattern is symmetrical on both sides, you don't have to worry about unpicking both sides. You can just pick your favourite one. But I did have to unpick both in this case because her mouth wasn't symmetrical. So you can see here I've brought the scanned image of her flat pattern pieces into Photoshop, and I'm going to get the eyes that I printed, they're the correct scale, and I'm going to bring them over and I'm going to overlay them where those lines are that I traced. You can see the trace lines on the actual minky pattern piece. They're not as wide as our actual printed image. The reason for that is the minky has stretched while it's actually been stuffed, so you're not going to get the exact same width when it is unstuffed, because then it is going to shrink back to its original form. So you don't want to shrink your eye, but you do want to take into consideration where you want your eye to start. So I'm still using it as a guide. I'm just going to line my eye up closer to the front seam, and then it can just stretch to the back a little bit and we should have roughly the same placement. Now the unfortunate thing is large sections of embroidery like this eye are going to affect the shape of your pattern, because that eye is going to stop the minky from stretching in that large area. So that's something you need to consider, and that's why you're not necessarily going to get a perfect result first time, because you may need to edit your pattern as you go in response to the effect of that large section of embroidery. So your head is usually going to be a little bit less wide. On Tempest here it didn't really have a noticeable result, so I didn't change her pattern, but on some other patterns I've definitely had quite large effects because of that large patch of embroidery. So you really want to keep in mind that this isn't necessarily going to be your first and only embroidery if you want it to be perfect for your plush. So you may have to edit your pattern to accommodate that large patch of embroidery, maybe make your head a little bit larger or add a little bit more area in front of the eye in your actual pattern. So here I'm just going through and I'm just roughly sketching where I want the nostrils to be using that scanned image as a guide, and I'm also going to use that guide to draw in the mouth. Now this is the tricky part, because we're going to have this mouth line up over the seam. So you can see in a minute that I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to measure the width of that smile on the left hand side, or that frown, sorry, and I'm going to bring that over to the middle, just to make sure that when I'm starting to draw the mouth in the middle on this middle gusset, that it is the same sort of diameter or width as the mouth on the side. And this is really important. You don't want to have a really thick line in the middle and a really thin one on the side, because when they line up along that seam it's not going to match and it's going to look a bit awkward. Now I'm just going to finish tracing the rest of that embroidery, and I'm going to make sure that both these mouths align on that gusset on both sides. So you can see what I'm doing here is I have those little notches on this side of my pattern pieces and in the centre gusset as well, and that's to line them up when I'm sewing. So I'm just going to rotate those pieces so that those little notches line up, and I want to make sure that the mouth touches where that seam is going to touch each other. So just to double check, I'm just rotating them around, making sure that they touch on both sides of the mouth, and in this case they did. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this image out, make sure that it's the correct scale for my embroidery, and then I'm going to open it up in my embroidery software, and we're going to digitize this into an embroidery file. I've imported my images into my embroidery software, and you can see that on the original image I've written how wide it needs to be, and this just makes sure that I have it in scale in the program, because I can check the width of the image. So I'm just going into my last Tempest Shadow embroidery file, and I'm stealing the nostrils because I liked the shape of those. So I'm just going to draw an outline in a straight stitch of that front nose gusset, and then I'm going to move those nostrils into place, lining up with where the nostrils are drawn on that little imported image, trying to make sure that they're in line with each other and pretty symmetrical. Now the mouth isn't the same because this one that I chose to make had a bit of a slant, so I just checked the width of the satin stitch that was on that old mouth, and I recreated it by just tracing a single line and then generating a satin stitch in my program. So just double checking the width here, making sure that it's correct, making sure that it lines up perfectly with that reference, and I'll just go in and tweak that line a tiny little bit until it's the right size, making sure that your satin stitch goes over the outside of your straight stitch that's going to sort of be the border of where your embroidery goes. You want to give yourself a little bit of wriggle room, so you don't want to have the mouth ending exactly where the embroidery file ends, because then you're going to have to stitch on the inside of your actual stitch line. So I'm just saving this mouth out as my embroidery file, and then I'll proceed to go in and digitize the eyes. The setup of your embroidery program is probably going to be different to mine, but you can still follow the same steps just using your particular program. So you can see here that I've generated a straight stitch that goes all the way around the outside of my head pattern, and this is going to be important later when we sketch out our pattern around our actual embroidery. So now I'm just going to go in and generate the satin stitch for the mouth, making sure that it matches the width of the satin stitch that I had in the middle gusset. I'm going to go around and create the eye whites first. I usually make sure that they overlap into the eyelashes and the sort of mascara looking outline of her head. Here I'm just going to manually digitize what amounts to an applique area for her blush, her eyelid, and I'm just doing that by having a straight stitch that goes all the way around, and then I'm going to stitch that out a couple of times, and then I'm going to have a small satin stitch that goes over the top of that straight stitch, which will hold that applique fabric in place. I'm just adjusting my stitch angles, getting rid of any unnecessary overhangs and little extra bits from when I placed it in there, making sure all the angles are correct, making sure the start and finish of the satin stitch is correct. And now I'm going to go in and do the iris, and I'm just going to make this a satin stitch. I'm going to increase the density a little bit, and I'm going to put in the angles that I want the embroidery lines to come out at for that wide satin stitch. Here I'm just going in and I'm adjusting where I want my little eye shine to be. I usually have a feature that is in my program called Remove Overlays, and what I do is I sketch out the eye shine and then I go Remove Overlays, and it removes all the layers underneath that, so that'll be the eyelid, the iris and the pupil, and then I go and put that white eye shine back on the original first white layer, so that all the layers on top of that actually create the outline of the eye shine, rather than embroidering white on top of the colours, which will lead to a pretty sloppy looking overlay. So here I'm just making sure that everything's fine. I did the same, I flipped it over and made the second eye on the other layer, and just adjusting everything, and soon I'll export this and I'll bring it over to my embroidery machine and we'll stitch these eyes out. So you want to make sure that the colours you use are pretty contrasting. I usually use some funky colours when I'm designing my embroidery designs, especially for the white. I usually use a bright yellow, just so that when I open it in my embroidery machine I can see the yellow, because white doesn't come up as anything on the white screen. I actually forgot to add her little scar here, so I'm just going in and saving that to the left hand side of the file. That's how the embroidery came out after I stitched it out on my machine. I purposefully used colours that weren't correct because I knew that I wasn't going to be using this as my final embroidery. Usually your first version isn't going to come out correctly, especially if you're going to be doing these mouths that go over seams, which is very complicated. You can see that her mouth didn't come out perfectly in this first time. I could have probably stitched it a little bit better, but I'm going to fix that, and then hopefully our next embroidery test will be our final one. You can see that the eyes came out quite nicely, but I did go in and tweak them to bring the iris and pupil a little bit more forward on the eye to match the reference. The thing with doing embroidery placement is that you're putting a 2D image, in this case the eyes, on a 3D plush, which is going to warp that image. So I'm going to compare that to the reference image, and I'm going to adjust what I need to so that it looks good from the front. Here you can see I've gone in and I've drawn where I want the mouth to be fixed, and I'm going to repeat the same process as I did before, unstuffing the entire plush, unpicking the whole thing. You want to snip off any seam allowance so that when you scan it, it's exactly the same size as your pattern, and we're going to repeat the process and then stitch this out on some darker fabric. So here you can see how Tempest came out after making those changes. I'm really happy with how this came out. The mouth fits perfectly. The only thing I might change is maybe the angle of the mouth to make her a little bit less grumpy, but you can see that moving those eyes with the iris and the pupil forward a little bit in that image helped make her look better from the front. It makes her look more like she's staring forward rather than she's a bit wall-eyed and spaced out. So just keep in mind that your first embroidery usually isn't going to be perfect, and in my case I usually stitch it out in the wrong colours to force myself to make it perfect the next time. Here I've just done the exact same thing on her mane and tail. When they were stuffed, I drew on all the images that I wanted to stitch on there, so I drew both the areas I want appliqued and the areas that I want satin stitched in a darker gold marker. And then I cut out everything, I unpicked it, I cut off the seam allowance, and then I scanned it into my Photoshop software and overlaid my original pattern. You can see here now I'm stitching that out on my embroidery machine. The steps are exactly the same. I just brought that image into Photoshop, drew on a bit more cleanly where I wanted those lines, those satin stitches and those applique areas, and then I exported that image into my embroidery software to create the final files. You can see here that I'm stitching it out a bit more neatly because this is the final version. I'm using wash away stabilizer rather than the white tear away, which on darker fabrics you're going to get sort of little flecks of white. It's fine if you're working on like a white or cream plush, but anything darker than that I'm going to usually use this wash away. So here's some tips on how to make sure that your embroidery comes out exactly where you want it on your pattern. So I've printed out a pony pattern here and I've stitched out her head, and you can see here where I've stitched out the outline at the front of her head in just a simple straight stitch. This is going to be used as a guide to make sure that our pattern lines up exactly. So I'm going to cut out my paper pattern, and I'm also going to cut out the eye and mouth so that it helps me line up the embroidery with the outer line of the pattern. So you can see here that I've cut away the stabilizer off the back of this pink pony's face, and I've just left the area at the front where I had that straight stitch because I'm going to use it as a guide to line up the rest of my pattern. So I've lined up the front of her face with her eye, her mouth, and that seam line that I drew in a straight stitch, and I'm just going in to mark the rest of the pattern. After I do this, I can get a pair of scissors and I can cut away that front area of stabilizer, and now I have a guide at the back of her head to help line up the front of her head, which will make sure that everything's in place within that pattern and you're not getting the eyes sort of warping off to one side or the mouth in the wrong spot. Especially when you're going to do mouths that go over seams, you want to make sure that they're very exactly in place, because if one mouth is lower than the other, then you're not going to have them lining up over that seam. So you can see here I'm just lining up the back piece and I'm lining up the eye and the mouth, so we have all these reference points to make sure that our embroidery is in the exact right spot. You'll see here that I haven't cut out the minky before I did my embroidery. I see a lot of people when they're starting out cutting it and trying to get their embroidery to line up on an already cut piece of minky. This just makes it way more difficult. So I like to cut out quite a generous piece of minky, do my embroidery, then sketch out your pattern piece and then cut it out afterwards. This is just going to make life much easier for you and make sure that your embroidery is in the exact same spot within your actual pattern piece. So I hope you guys learned a lot from this tutorial on how to get perfect embroidery placement. Generally, I would recommend making sure that you do your embroidery, then cut out your fabric. Make sure that you do the method where you make your final head, draw out all the embroidery you want, scan it in, and then use that as the basis for your embroidered digitized files. So also keep in mind that you're usually not going to get a perfect result first time, especially with complex things like mouths that span over seams. If you have any questions, send me a private message. I hope you learned a bunch from this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!